The Extra Deck has been one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most seminal components ever since its inception. Almost as fundamental to the game as its lack of a mana system. That monsters can be utilized from outside of the main deck meant not only that the risk of drawing and breaking on these monsters was averted, but also that unrelated monsters could be turned into monsters with better effects. If I control 2 vanilla monsters, of which one is a tuner, and their levels add up to level 8, I now have the ability of summoning a Stardust Dragon. Now, these useless cards suddenly have been made powerful. But more than that, if I determined that Stardust Dragon isn't useful in this situation, but instead I need to get rid of one of my opponent's cards, I could make Dark End Dragon instead. These options are why the Extra Deck is as valuable and as game defining as it is in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't just let you turn your weaker monsters into a stronger monster, but it also gives you the choice of what monster to turn those weaker monsters into. At its core, the Extra Deck acts as a toolbox. It allows the player to slot in effects based on what it is their deck requires. Although in modern combo decks, this utility has been replaced with a formulaic blueprint for predetermined combos. This is more indicative of a shift in current game design than the Extra Deck's potential. And besides that, combo pieces can be swapped out for other ones if the duelist decides to do a different combo. In all of these cases, however, the monster still has to be properly summoned first. In turn, this means that their summoning conditions have to be met. To summon Stardust Dragon, I need to generate 8 stars worth of material. To make a Nightmare Phoenix, I need 2 link materials. This condition slightly compromises the Extra Deck's ability to act as a pure toolbox. They still require to be built towards and thus to be planned for in deck building and while comboing. Whereas a true toolbox lets you pull out the tools needed at that moment, the Extra Deck's conventional use more closely resembles a setup payoff routine. That is not to say that the Extra Deck as a mechanic has failed, but rather that its usage is not that of a true toolbox. As a player, you can only use the tools your deck gives access to. However, there has been a new design trend in how Konami treats the Extra Deck. It's not a replacement for its standard usage, but instead a new option next to it, namely the ability of directly sending monsters from the Extra Deck to the graveyard. And similar to archetypal hand traps, which I discussed in my video Chain Halfness and the Birth of Yu-Gi-Oh's Turn 0, this mechanic is still in its relative infancy, with only a handful amount of decks and cards capable of making use of it. And yet, that handful is already enough to get an understanding of its possibilities. Because of that, the goal of this video will be to look at what has been done and what could still be done. Cards that send monsters from the Extra Deck directly to the graveyard, or Extra Deck monsters that benefit from being directly sent to the graveyard, have existed for quite a while. Think about Yugioh, a 2010 monster that can send any card from the Extra Deck to the graveyard at the cost of 3000 life points, though it has seen no play outside of being a gimmicky FTK enabler. As for the second category of cards, examples include Herald of Arclight and Psyframe Lord Omega, both of which provide utility without hitting the field, despite never being designed to be directly sent, as is evident from the archetypes they are a part of. This utility of the Extra Deck was not made use of until 2015, when the Necros archetype released. This deck consisted of a hyper-consistent ritual summoning engine, and one of the main contributors to this consistency was the ritual spell, Necros Kaleidoscope. This card can ritual summon any Necros ritual monster by sending any monster of the same level from the Extra Deck to the graveyard. In practice, this meant that the majority of Necros builds slotted in 2 copies of Arclight in order to search a further ritual piece, after summoning Necros of Unicorn. Released in the same year was Infernoid Tierra, a fusion monster that can force both players to send 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. Similar to Kaleidoscope, its designated sends were rather limited. The Infernoid Zodiac decks contained only 1 copy of Psyframe Lord Omega, whereas the 2019 versions of Pure Infernoid selected to play only Omega and several copies of Elder Entity Entis. Both Necros Kaleidoscope and Infernoid Tierra were powerful within their respective strategies, yet neither made full use out of the mechanic they were exploiting. Kaleidoscope utilizes the free effect granted to it by sending Arclight, yet with no good targets except Arclight to abuse. It couldn't alter its second effect based on the game state. Still, Konami would continue to slowly expand on the mechanic, drip feeding out cards that either sent or wanted to be sent. Extra Foolish Burial was a spell card that let you send any card from the extra deck. Yet its limitation on setting any spells or traps for the rest of that turn guaranteed that it wouldn't see any competitive play. Elder Entity Entis was a level 4 fusion monster that could destroy any card on the field once sent to the graveyard. Its lack of a once per turn, combined with the simple power of its effect, made it undoubtedly the best generic extra deck sent moving forward. Yet the lack of cards to fully utilize it outside of exactly Tierra kept it out of competitive viability for now. Finally, at the beginning of 2020, the Final of the Heralds was printed as a manga promo in Japan. Upon summon, it can send any fairy from the extra deck or, which is the relevant effect for this video, extra deck to the graveyard, including Arclight and Entis. Unlike Kaleidoscope, the Final had enough targets to change its effect based on the game state. Either you pop or you search. Yet, unlike Kaleidoscope, the Final Send was hardly a secondary effect, but instead its core effect. Although its level modulation was by no means trivial, it was exclusively played due to its ability to send Arclight. The extra deck send was its core utility. Without the effect gained of Arclight, it would not see play. This is different from Kaleidoscope, which would see play just for its free ritual summon, with the effect gained from sending Arclight being a powerful bonus rather than its purpose. At the same time, the Final also marks Konami's recognition of the power afforded by sending extra deck cards directly to the graveyard. The Final, after all, only exists to do exactly that. Without Arclight to be sent by it, the Final would not have been created, and later that same year, Konami would start to explicitly embrace this design potential. Released in the core set Return of the Duelist, Dogmatika was the introduction to the Abyss storyline. They formed a church-like organization which harshly condemned those opposed to it. On the level of gameplay, this manifested as an utter disdain for the extra deck. Several of their monsters have the ability to summon themselves from the hand if a monster special summoned from the extra deck is on the field. Some of them cannot be destroyed by monsters summoned from the extra deck. And many of their effects also prohibit you from summoning out of the extra deck yourself. Yet, Dogmatika's most defining aspect was not its rejection of the extra deck, but instead how it utilized its own extra deck. To show this, let's take a look at one of its most powerful cards, Nadir Servant. Its effect is to send a monster from the extra deck to the graveyard, then add a Dogmatika monster with equal or lower attack from the deck or graveyard to the hand. The second half is just like any archetypal rota, yet the first part is what makes it so powerful. By allowing it to send any extra deck monster, the duelist can handpick a bonus effect for it depending on the game state. They can send Entis for an immediate pop going second. They can send Garura to turn Nadir Servant into a Sky Striker Mobilize Engages. Or they can send Titaniclad to access any Dogmatika card they hadn't yet gone through during the end phase. Many other cards of Dogmatika embody the same idea. Relevant cards include Dogmatika Maximus, which sends 2 cards from both players' extra deck to the graveyard. Or Dogmatika Punishment, which sends a monster from the extra deck to the graveyard in order to pop a monster with equal or lower attack. Or Dogmatika Lenity, which is the archetype's version of Necro's Kaleidoscope. Although Dogmatika initially centered around only a small series of its main deck monsters, it eventually received access to 2 ritual monsters. Both of these had effects to send from the extra deck to the graveyard once the opponent performs a specific action, either from both extra decks or only from the opponent's extra deck. Dogmatika Matrix was a ritual support that let you send 1 monster from either extra deck if you control both rituals. This makes them unique interruptions, where the effect of the disruption depends on what your opponent is doing and how you decide to respond. It has the same utility as Nadir Servant or Dogmatika Punishment. You can design your extra deck based on what is useful, like a true toolbox to cover as many relevant scenarios as possible, without having to depend on drawing the actual cards. This is what differentiates Dogmatika drastically from decks like Necros or Drytron, each of which possessed 1 card capable of sending from deck to extra deck. In those decks, those specific cards were not key factors within how the deck was built, and to utilize the ability to send from the extra deck to the graveyard, those cards needed to be searched or drawn. In Dogmatika, where half of the cards have this ability, this isn't the case, due to the sheer abundance of extra deck sends. As Dogmatika player, you first will always have access to picking whatever effect you desire at that moment, forcing your opponent to likewise consider each effect whenever a card is activated. If you want to destroy your cards, you have 5 cards you can give that effect in addition to their own effect. In Dogmatika, more so than Necros or Infernite, the skill lies in what card you send and when you send that card. Of course, being able to clue extra effects onto your cards doesn't come for free. To do this, Dogmatika had to pay a high cost, not only in the form of most Dogmatika cards locking you out of summoning from the extra deck, but also in how much extra deck space it takes up to send as many options as possible. The more effects you want access to, the more different cards you have to put into the extra deck. In practice, this resulted in 2 ways of building Dogmatika. The first is the competitively viable version, where it splits with Invoked and Shadow, and thus the cards specifically played to be sent off the Dogmatika cards take up only a portion of the extra deck, and thus it results in less toolbox potential. The second variation barely summons from the extra deck at all, like pure Dogmatika builds or Dogmatika Regenesis, and thus they can devote almost their entire extra deck towards sending from the extra deck. And yet, when the deck released, most of the sends played by Dogmatika were cards with accidental graveyard effects, rather than those designed to be sent. Think of cards like Ignister Wind Pegasus or Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. The Abyss lore that Dogmatika was a part of did feature a series of fusion monsters, the Fallen of Aubas fusions, which were designed to be sent from the extra deck to the graveyard, while still being good monsters to summon. Several branded cards like Branded in High Spirits and Mirror Jade the Iceblade Dragon also sent one of these fusions from the extra deck, to give extra follow-up on top of their standard effects. Besides Titaniclad, however, none of these cards were useful inside Dogmatika, leaving the deck to pile together whatever extra deck monsters happened to have useful graveyard effects. And this remained the case for the next 2 years. Using the extra deck as a pure toolbox remained confined to a very specific deck, and the cards used for this purpose remained cards mostly not originally designed for this purpose. Antis and Arclight act as exceptions to this rule, although these cards were originally never designed to be sent directly. The success they enjoyed following this new capacity has resulted in Konami designing cards specifically around this. We first saw this with Necro's Kaleidoscope, and the Final of the Heralds continued that idea. The Dogmatika ritual monsters likewise have low enough attacks to be searched of Nadir Servant by sending Arclight. Regardless, the cards that are sent from the extra deck to the graveyard are mostly accidental, and part of this is because it was still a niche mechanic. Only Dogmatika and some outdated decks could actually send directly from the extra deck. There was no pressing need to print cards for Dogmatika, at least not yet. That changed in the middle of 2022 with the release of Power of the Elements. On top of boosting the power level massively by introducing sprite and T elements, and marking the true beginning of archetypal hand traps through T elements halfness. This set also included a new Dogmatika-like card, the spell card Ultimate Slayer. This normal spell sends any extra deck monster to the graveyard as cost. Then it targets a monster your opponent controls of the same extra deck type as the sent monster in order to return that monster to the extra deck. It is a basic spell card that can return almost any boss monster to the extra deck, with the toolbox effect added because a 1-for-1 board breaker would be unplayable in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Although it would take time for Ultimate Slayer to see more widespread play, its existence alone was enough to impact future card design. It means that every deck, if they so desired, now had access to the powerful extra deck toolbox, and thus were able to pick and choose effects that they otherwise have no access to. Of course, this still has the aforementioned issues of Ultimate Slaying having to be drawn, and that the format needs to be suitable to make it worth playing. Regardless, its existence gives every deck the option, regardless of whether it is correct or not. What Ultimate Slayer enables is for the mechanic to become more generic, more universal. If more than one specific deck can make use of it, then it also becomes possible for Konami to print more cards designed for it. We saw this immediately in the next two sets, with Logic Aggregator and Tribal Gate Bucephalus being printed shortly thereafter, and with the clear and obvious intent of them being sent directly to the graveyard. Their on-field effects exist only out of obligation, but they are never actually worth summoning. The level 6 Synchro monster Malong similarly fulfills this function, and later cards such as Enigmaster Packbit and Eclipse Twins also appear to be designed primarily for this purpose, with their on-field effects serving as nice bonuses that might come up. At the same time, the sense of Ultimate Slayer have become automatized. Extra decks, especially those in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, are incredibly compact, and because of that, it's a tall ask to include cards whose only function is to be sent from the extra deck, and especially when it's for the purposes of being sent off a non-engine board breaker, such as Ultimate Slayer. As a result, players tend to select specific targets to send off Slayer, one for each extra deck type, or excluding certain types at all, depending on the metagame. Typically, it is Logic for XYZs, Bucephalus for links, Malong for synchros, and then Entis or Garua for fusions. Depending on the format, the specific choices may differ, yet what remains true is that only one target for each type gets used. When signing Slayer against an XYZ deck, it gains the bonus effect of Logic's negate, yet it always has this negate. Rather than serving as a toolbox, Ultimate Slayer is interwoven into standard play patterns. What Ultimate Slayer shows is that the more generic you make sending cards from the extra deck to the graveyard, the more it loses its toolbox potential. Meanwhile, it appears that only a deck like Dogmatika, which solely revolves around the mechanic, can utilize it without diluting it. Yet in my opinion, there have been two decks that have managed to invoke the spirit of the mechanic's toolbox promise without needing to make it its entire identity. These decks would be Labyrinth and Ryzeal. Now, the way Labyrinth enables this, of course, is because it doesn't need its extra deck at all. Besides some cards like Chaos Angel, Typhon and Muckraker, one could play an entire tournament and not need anything. Consequently, this resulted in the deck adopting a big variety of extra deck compositions throughout its various incarnations. Extravagance builds played 3 of every important card to summon, Super Poly builds played up to 10 fusion targets, and the simultaneous equation cannon builds spent almost the entire extra deck on useless cards in order to resolve one incredibly powerful trap card. All of this is to say, Labyrinth can easily spend a large amount of its extra deck on supporting strategies that do not ask you to summon from it. And with the generic nature of Dogmatika Punishment and its effect being able to trigger all of the Labyrinth recursion, this makes it a viable way to build the Labyrinth extra deck. To showcase this, let's take a look at Dinkabui's Labyrinth deck from Ryzeal's Bologna in 2023. His list played a total of 6 targets to send off the 1 punishment in his deck, including all of the common ones, as well as 2 that only work within specific decks, namely Chimera the King of Phantom Beasts and Baphomet the Mythical King of Phantom Beasts. These cards, while they are in the graveyard, can as a quick effect banish themselves during the opponent's turn to summon either a fiend from your graveyard or a fiend from your banished. Especially Baphomet's inclusion is relevant, as normally getting your lovely Labyrinth banished is a huge blow to the deck's grind game and power. With these cards, Labyrinth is able to fully showcase the potential of the mechanic. Unlike Dogmatika, it doesn't purely revolve around it, and unlike Drytron, it is not limited to 1 or 2 predetermined options that disallow for toolboxing. Instead, the Labyrinth player has a reasonably wide range of options available to them, both in deck building with the amount of slots they can assign to punishment, and in gameplay with the plethora of distinct effects they now have access to. Dogmatika Punishment's send means that it not only is a question of what to remove and when to remove it, but also with what to remove it. Do I as player want to draw a card, do I want to pop another card, or do I want to revive one of my own monsters later on? The present game state determines which one is correct, and it's the player's task to decide what is correct at that given moment. But this extra dimension to the decision is possible only because of the toolbox nature of cards like Punishment and Nadir Servant, adding an aspect to Yu-Gi-Oh decision making, absent from most standard decks. This is not to say that Labyrinth incorporates it perfectly, nor that Labyrinth represents the future of the mechanic, although it effectively employs the extra deck as a toolbox without making it the core identity of the deck. Its ability to send from the extra deck and thus to access this toolbox centralizes around 1 trap card. Although it is not hard to access Punishment through Lady Labyrinth, it also is not easy, especially not in a game with lots of interaction. A deck that does this more easily than Labyrinth, while still having a decent number of choices, surprisingly is Ryzeal. Extra Ryzeal is one of the several main deck Ryzeal monsters, and it can summon itself from the hand, at the supposed cost of sending an XYZ monster from the extra deck to the graveyard. Players quickly realized the synergy it had with Mirror Logic Aggregator, because it meant that X going second was both imperm, a search that also chain blocked its own search. It made the card into a 1-card starter and a board breaker, and more options for X to send became available over time. Eclipse Twins gave you extra detonator pops by reviving your detonator after popping itself, and the new Fallen, the Super Psy Sky Blaster, makes X also into an MST. X can also send Exciter Knight in Fiendsmith builds, in case a light fiend in the graveyard is needed, or totally awesome to retrieve a water monster from the graveyard, or just a copy of Ryzeal Dual Drive or Detonator to attach it to a summoned Dual Drive, and give you hand trap protection after searching Ryzeal Cross. Like Dogmatika Punishment in Labyrinth, Extra Ryzeal has a diverse number of sends, yet unlike Punishment, it is incredibly easy to access. Every Ryzeal starter inevitably gets you to it, and thus gets you to an extra deck send. So it is no wonder that X is by far the most powerful Ryzeal card. What Ryzeal X and Dogmatika Punishment show is that you can give a deck the option to send from the extra deck without making that option the sole focus of the deck, like it was without Dogmatika. And you can also do it without giving it only 1 or 2 options, like in Infernoid and like in Drytron, and it accomplishes this simply because Ryzeal didn't have an incredibly tight extra deck, and because summoning X was part of any basic combo. In fact, Extra Ryzeal was considered the best starter precisely because of its ability to send extra deck cards. Consequently, it shows how powerful it is to add a free effect on top of your starters, especially in a deck that is not significantly locked as a result of adding this free effect. Decks like Ryzeal and Labyrinth show the extra deck can become more of a toolbox in the future, through adding more cards and specifically more engine cards that are capable of sending without making the focus of the deck.